I think we're live. Great. I think I'm actually live. Wow. I think we finally got it to work. So there we go. Well, here we have a YouTube live. I'm actually live on YouTube. So here I am. I'm sitting in my living room, and I've finally figured out how to work YouTube Live. It was the encoding software that was throwing me off. I thought it was just like Facebook Live, where you just plug it in. Anyhow, I'm sitting here in live, and figured I would just see how this works. As you can see behind me, there are books. I must say YouTube comments can be interesting. Now, every so often on YouTube, you'll get a comment that you can't quite comprehend. And there was a few years ago, someone put a comment on one of my YouTube videos, and they said, he's smart because he's sitting in front of books. And I wondered about that because on the one hand, I thought maybe this person was being completely sarcastic and saying, oh, look, he's trying to convince us he's smart because there's books behind him, but he's actually not that smart, and ha ha ha, yeah, you tried to convince us you were smart. So maybe that was what they were saying. But on the other hand, it's possible that maybe the person actually did think I was intelligent simply because there were books behind me. And with YouTube comments, you can never really tell. Every so often you get one that's just like sarcastic, and it's sarcastic to the point where you can't really tell if the person is being sarcastic or not. Now, okay, so I'm seeing sarcastic to me. All right, people are hearing me. Very good. All right, this is quite interesting. So I'm on here. You can ask me about politics, world events, whatever you feel like asking me about. I see Bob Marston, Facebook friend. He put a test in there. Good to see you, Bob. I ran into Bob when I was out in Berkeley, when I was covering the rioting and the fighting out there, the clashes. Bob was somebody who's followed my work on the internet, and so I was able to have dinner with him when I was out there. It was an interesting chat. Good to hear from you, Bob. Have you ever heard the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? I don't even know anything about that. Darth sounds... I'm thinking Star Wars is what I'm thinking, and I haven't yet seen the new Star Wars movie. When you say Darth, that makes me think of Star Wars, so perhaps that's what you're getting at. But anyway, I'm just kind of relieved I figured out how to do this. When I first set this up, I assumed it would just be like Facebook Live, but apparently it's not. But yeah, it's Saturday evening. Christmas is 2 days away from us, and we're all just kind of sitting here and enjoying ourselves. Let me see. Oh, is there more coming in? Oh, someone called me a revisionist. Now, that's an interesting term. Now, it's very, very interesting, the word revisionist. I want to talk about this because I assume the person who called me a revisionist is a Marxist or a communist of some stripe. But if you say revisionist to most people on the street, what they think of is people that don't agree with history. They think that history is being told incorrectly. There's different kinds of revisionists out there. Or think of editors, right? I mean, it could be another word for an editor, someone who's like revising. If you write something and someone revises it, they're a revisionist. Or, there's what you call historical revisionism. People that say, hey, the way we understand this historical event is all wrong, or that event is all wrong. But the way Marxists generally mean it, this term actually dates back to, well, it goes way back. It goes way back to after Karl Marx's death. There was a figure named Edward Bernstein. And Edward Bernstein, he was a very prominent European Marxist. I believe he was in Germany. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it was Austria. But I believe he was in Germany. And he basically said that a lot of Marx's principles were wrong, and he argued that because there was universal male suffrage, right, all men could vote. It almost caused you pain to say it. The idea of women voting was just completely out there, but because there was universal male suffrage, that this idea that we needed a revolution or the proletariat was out of date. Edward Bernstein, his slogan was, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, he called himself a revisionist. Most of the Marxists in the world didn't accept Bernstein's ideas. They said, we reject this revisionism. But Edward Bernstein was very proud. He said, I am a revisionist. I am revising Marxism, bringing it up to date. People didn't buy it. And then, the term didn't exactly show up very much after that. But then in 1961, when China and the Soviet Union had their falling out. The term that China used to describe Khrushchev and the leadership of the Soviet Union was they called them revisionists. That was the word. And they said they were revising Marxism, just like Edward Bernstein, after Marx had died, had been revising Marx's ideas and making them non-revolutionary. That the Khrushchev and the leaders of the Soviet Union, these Chinese forces argued, were revisionists. And it's very interesting because, China was saying that they had the pure line of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin, and then Mao Zedong, and that Mao Zedong thought was just the true interpretation of the theories of all these people. And that these other leaders were revising it. And, it wasn't until 1969, very interesting, it wasn't until 1969 that in China they started saying things like the Soviet Union wasn't just revisionist, they weren't just betrayers, but they were arguing that the Soviet Union were what they called social imperialists, saying that they were just as bad as the USA. And eventually, in about 1971 or 72, you had Chinese leaders that were saying that the Soviet Union was actually the main danger to the people of the world. And so with that doctrine, that's why Richard Nixon, at the time that he was bombing Vietnam, he was widely hated in the United States. He was welcomed to China, and that China embraced and started to really align with the United States based on the idea that the Soviet Union no longer saying that they were revisionists, but actually saying that they were social imperialists. And I think that the division between the Soviet Union and China was really essential in what you might call the victory in the Cold War by the United States. The fact that the USA was able to pull the two Eurasian superpowers away from each other and had, China's allies around the world and different countries were aligned with the United States against the allies of the Soviet Union. I mean, that was a big deal. So yeah, the word revisionist is an interesting one. I don't go around using that word at this point because I don't think that these ideas are like religion. I don't think it's like, the holy word of Marx said, and therefore it is internally true because Marx said so. I mean, I do think that, that when there are people pointing out things by different leaders that were inaccurate or accommodating to the powers that be, that's one thing. But I don't go around using that word because I don't like it. And also because I don't like the terminology. I mean, when you say revisionist, to most people that are not in this kind of little left-wing enclave, the thing that they think of immediately is Holocaust revisionists. They think of these, these crazy anti-Semitic people who think that, the Holocaust didn't happen. That's what they think of. They don't think of people who have a bad idea about communism. So it's just not a word that I use. But it's interesting that gets thrown at me a lot. So now I have a lot to catch up on. Thanks for waiting, everybody. I'm so sorry I wasn't on right at 8:30. It took me forever to figure this out. But now I've been called revisionist. What else is fun on here? We've heard from Bob Marston. Someone, MPR, appreciates my reporting. Have you heard that Trump plans to supply Ukraine with lethal weapons? That contradicts the Trump-Russia narrative. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, this whole crisis in Ukraine, let's just talk about facts here, okay? Ukraine had an elected president, Yanukovych. He was the elected leader of the Ukraine. This is the person that people in the Ukraine voted for. And then there was a mass movement that was basically funded by Western countries. Western countries funded these kind of extremist forces in the streets. People call them ultra-nationalists. You can call them different things. And they toppled the elected government and installed a government in Kiev that was extremely hostile to Russia. And now you have people in the eastern parts of Ukraine who are very sympathetic to Russia. And they, there's these forces, these extreme forces in the western parts of Ukraine that blame the Soviet Union and Russia for all their problems. There's forces in the east part of Ukraine that are more sympathetic to Russia and have a more positive opinion of Russia. And so when these fanatics that were brought to power in 2014 took over and toppled the elected government, people in the east said, look, we don't want to live under this. And at the same time, there was a ban on teaching the Russian language in schools. They were tearing down the monuments to people who fought in the Second World War. So there was a divide. Now, the way that this gets told in American media, the story that we all hear is we hear, oh my goodness, Russia is invading Ukraine. I mean, this is just outrageous. I remember at the time it was happening. It was just kind of scary, and this whole idea, let's talk about Crimea. So Crimea has been part of Russia for like all of history. It's a place that Russia's key naval and military bases have been located. In 1956, when Khrushchev came to power at the 20th Party Congress of the Soviet Union, they then declared, that Crimea would belong to Ukraine, and this was some kind of backroom deal in Soviet leaders. So then, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a treaty signed that Ukraine would get Crimea. Crimea would remain part of Ukraine. Ukraine was no longer part of the Soviet Union. It was no longer Ukrainian Soviet Republic. It was an independent country, but that Russia would be able to keep its military base there. And Crimea is not a very big place. It's kind of a smaller area, and the majority of people that are living there have something to do with this really big military base that's there. So then, when this fanatically anti-Russian government seized power in Kiev, at that point, the people in Crimea voted in a referendum to join with Russia. So this was not an invasion of Crimea. I mean, this narrative that we have that, it's like you get the impression that, all these forces were storming over the border and this was some kind of big war. That's not what happened. The military base was there. It had been there since the fall of the Soviet Union. There had been a Soviet military base there even beforehand. And this military base and this region that's historically been part of Russia until 1956 when Khrushchev made this backroom deal or whatever happened, it rejoined, and now it's part of the Russian Federation. When I was in Russia, I attended the World Festival of Youth and Students. I met a lot of young people from Crimea, from the Republic of Crimea. They were there. They had these jackets on, said Republic of Crimea. They weren't talking about, oh, we got invaded. They were there. People in Crimea speak Russian. They consider themselves to be Russian. It's a Russian military base that's there. So that's just, that narrative is completely false. But let's look down here. I'm disappointed to hear that. The fact that we'd be giving weapons to this government in Kiev, this government in the this fanatical government in East Ukraine or in West Ukraine, I should say. I'm sorry. That's a bad idea. And the idea that Trump is working for Russia, he's a Russian agent, that's absurd. And I wish our media would just stop harping on that point because it's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. And when people on the left, I must say, repeat that, what they're essentially doing is they're demanding that Trump be hawkish, right? Because that's what they're doing. When left-wing people go around saying, "Oh my God, Trump works for Russia. Trump is sympathetic to Putin," what are they demanding? What they're demanding: Trump prove us wrong, prove us wrong. So by repeating this RussiaGate narrative, what you're essentially doing is lobbying for World War III. You're demanding a new war. So I wish people with leftist views, you don't have to agree with this or that, but the idea that you would be repeating that is just wrong. So my friend who calls himself Pro-Gun Red, a longtime friend of mine. Good to see you, Pro-Gun Red. I'm hoping that you'll come to my birthday celebration in New York City. You're a longtime friend of mine. We go back many years. He says, "Hey, comrade." Okay. I never understand why China did that. Why are tankies correct and the best anarchist geeks wrong? Well, this is some internet, internet leftist in talk. I don't want to get too bogged down in it. We've had a lot of that already. But this idea that, they call certain communists that are like allies of anti-imperialist states, they get labeled tankies. This comes from actually the British Communist Party. There was the tankies and the Euros. There was a division because there was Euro communism. That was like 1978, 1979. The Spanish Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party, they started to essentially to disagree with the Soviet Union. They were criticizing the Soviet Union, so people called them Euro-communists. And in the British Communist Party, there was a division. There were some that remained and continued to defend the Soviet Union, and there were some that called themselves Euro-communists and were siding with the Italian and the Spanish Communist Party and criticizing the Soviet Union, and the Portuguese Communist Party, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So that was the division, and they called them tankies because of that whole thing in Western media about Soviet tanks, right? We've seen this many times, and I think this is actually one of the most effective propaganda things that we've heard from the West, because whenever they would portray the Soviet Union or forces sympathetic to the Soviet Union or even the Chinese government, they always portrayed them with tanks, and that's a way of kind of making it so it's not people. The idea is that these aren't people defending their livelihoods. This isn't a political position. This is just this cold, mechanical piece of machinery coming down on people. This is a very effective propaganda tactic. So the Soviet tank was seen as the symbol of evil and totalitarianism. So then those on the left who refused to denounce the Soviet Union or defended Soviet actions, they called themselves tankies, or they didn't call themselves that. That was actually a derogatory term leveled at them. And now there's a whole thing on the internet about tankies, and here are the tankies, look out for the tankies. It's a big thing online. This is all left-wing in talk. This is a very, very small enclave, but it's worth chatting about. So let me continue to look down here. A lot going on here. Okay. Oh. My thoughts on Nepal. Well, I am very excited about the possibility of this new railroad going through Nepal. Like China, it wants to start building a new railway through Nepal, and this is being supported by the communist parties in Nepal that are participating in the elections. This is very exciting. I mean, and this is China's, China's what China's been doing all over the world. They've been building infrastructure and promoting development, and I think that's great, and I think it's very exciting. And I must say, I followed Nepal when I was like, just getting into this kind of politics. I was more influenced by some of the quote unquote Maoist stuff, and so Nepal was one of the countries where there was a revolutionary movement that was calling itself Maoist. So I followed it. And I remembered, I think it was 2007, I believe, that the king stepped down, and then the eight-party coalition declared a republic, and all of that. And it was weird because at the same time, Bolivarianism was happening. In Latin America, you had Hugo Chavez with the nationalized oil resources, and Evo Morales, and I was just as excited about that. But all these so-called, Maoists, I use that term in quotes because I don't want to, label anybody anything. I remember they were all saying to me, "Oh my God, this is just revisionism, all this, and exciting things were happening in Latin America at the time, but you weren't allowed to like that. But then Nepal, you were supposed to like it, and then it was very weird. I didn't quite understand, and I didn't feel like, I mean, Nepal is a very poor country. I know that there's a lot of difficulty. I know there's a lot of disagreements then. I know the Communist Party of Nepal, Maoist, was key in bringing down the absolute monarchy that ruled over the country, establishing a democratic government. And now, since then, there have been some divisions, and there's the Congress Party, which is, a pro-capitalist party, which is in there. And, there's a lot of different contradictions. I don't follow it all. And there's also like the Workers and Peasants Party of Nepal, and there's a lot of like Marxist parties in Nepal. A lot of these Marxist parties really do want to support and cooperate with China in building infrastructure, even though, from what I understand, a lot of these Marxist parties still don't support China as socialist. They argue, they take the position that China is state capitalist or something like that, but they still want to cooperate with it, which is interesting. It's interesting to follow. But yeah, the idea that a new railroad in Nepal, that's very good. And India has a history of kind of, I guess you could argue, intervening in Nepal, and so maybe folks in Nepal who are resentful of India might be excited about this railway too, because they resent Indian intervention, because a lot of people in Nepal that I've spoken to say they feel like they don't like India intervening. Interesting stuff. Yeah. Oh boy. So what else is here? Oh boy. So how will the mainstream media keep things hidden in 2018? Having in mind all the moving parts. Well, I must say the thing that worries me the most right now is internet censorship, okay? I am deeply worried about what when Eric Schmidt said that, that they were actively trying to prevent RT from showing up in YouTube searches. That's very scary, or in Google searches. That's really scary to me. The idea that Google is actively deranking things for political reasons. I think I've heard rumors that they, and I saw some reports indicating that they had possibly done this also to the World Socialist website, and that's quite interesting as well. But yeah, I mean, that's the idea that they would be doing that is not good at all. And I feel like right now there's an effort to kind of scale back the computer revolution and the information revolution. Because right now information is widely accessible, ideas that people never had access to. Look, I'll tell you all something, right? People know that I'm a little bit of a leftist or a Marxist, socialist, communist, whatever you want to call it. And, I remember when I was first looking into these ideas, I assumed that there was no communists in the USA. I'd been told, my whole life had told me communism was pure evil. It's failed everywhere ever it's been tried. There's millions of them. Millions of people died. It's a disaster. It's evil. The Soviet Union collapsed. I had no clue. And I remember, but I started thinking, well, maybe there is some truth in these socialist ideas or something like that. And so I remember I got on the internet, I typed in communist, and I discovered that, lo and behold, there was actually a communist party in the United States. And I would have had no way of knowing that if I had not been for the internet. And I mean, this was the '90s, so I mean, that's not it's not like the internet was what it is now at that point. But I remember when that happened, I discovered, oh my God, not only are there communists in the United States, there's hundreds of different groups that all have different ideologies. I was fascinated by it. I found it to be really fascinating. But if the internet hadn't been there, how would I have done it? Now, I've heard some people who have told me that back before the internet, that libraries used to have this thing called the Encyclopedia of Associations. And that if you were interested in looking for communist groups, you'd go to the library, you'd find the Encyclopedia of Associations, and it would just be a list of groups about all kinds of things. And there would be like a section on communism, and it would just have a list of every organization in the USA that was associated with communism and their address. And yeah, there was somebody I used to know, and he told me he remembered very well going to the library, getting the Encyclopedia of Associations. So I was at least there with the internet. The internet existed in the late 90s when I was first starting to look into these ideas. But yeah, imagine the Encyclopedia of Associations. And I think this points to the bigger problem in U.S. societies, which is, the average person in the USA has no clue what Marxists believe. I mean, they just don't. Either they have just a Cold War caricature of it, or it's just, what average Marxists believe, people just have no clue about. I kind of touched on this in my Socialist Billionaires video that's been rather controversial. It's my last, not live, but video I did. This is my first time I've ever live, so forgive me. It's not what I'm used to doing, but I'm having a good time here. Let's see what people have had to say. Oh boy. Indeed, we must protect RT because they keep it real. Hey, I love RT. Of course I do. But, we do good work, and, there you go. Will you stand with the DPRK during this time of heightened aggression? Well, first of all, let me point out that as a journalist, I don't go around. When I'm a journalist, everything I do, I try to be completely objective about. I'm not here to cheerlead for anyone. I'm not here to opine or editorialize with my journalism. So we're putting my journalism aside now when you ask that question. Will I stand with them? Let's be honest. I wouldn't trade with the people in the DPRK for anything. If you look at what that country has been through, there was the Korean War where something like 4 million Koreans died. 4 million people. That's quite a bit. It's not a small number. Every building above 1 story tall was bombed, was blown up, and just the war crimes that were going on. They actually were going to make a documentary about North Korea about the Korean War. It was going to be called The Unknown War, and they wouldn't show it on American TV because they thought U.S. audiences couldn't handle it. And it was for the BBC. They wouldn't show it on American TV. So there was the Korean War. And then after that, the country was divided, and there was actually quite a bit of economic success in the 60s and 70s and even the early 80s in North Korea. In fact, if you Google the phrase North Korean economic miracle, you can find an article from the BBC where they talk about that. With Soviet support, North Korea, they built up the steel industry, they achieved universal literacy, universal housing, they built a bunch of hospitals. They really did, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, do a lot to raise the standard of living for the population. And no one ever talks about that. Now the mass starvation, that's the thing that people talk about, and that happened in the 1990s. And why did the mass starvation happen in North Korea? It's because North Korea is the northern part of the country, keep in mind, and the arable land in Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, is mostly in the south. So they have very little arable land. So their food production system that they built is largely dependent on oil. And it's a very complex food production system, but if they didn't have gasoline for those tractors, they really needed oil to run their food production system in order to, to keep growing their own food. And when the Soviet Union fell, and the Soviet Union couldn't offer them any support anymore, and then at that point we had the petrodollar, and to buy oil you needed dollars, and the USA had sanctions on North Korea. They could not get dollars. So at that point, the agricultural system of North Korea, which is a mountainous country without very much arable land, it came to a halt. And in North Korea, the North Korean government, they refer to this as what they call the Arduous March. And this was basically the Arduous March. And yes, there were a whole lot of deaths due to malnutrition during that period. And it was a crisis. And it was actually during that crisis, of mass starvation that North Korea first indicated in 1994 that they would seek to acquire nuclear weapons. They might withdraw from the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. So at that point, Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright went there, and they agreed to make a deal with North Korea that in exchange for them keeping in the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty and allowing, International Atomic Energy Agency's inspectors in there to make sure they weren't, getting a nuclear weapon or anything like that. In exchange for that, the USA was going to give them oil and heating gas and food and medical supplies and all kinds of things. And that deal was made by the Clinton administration, and for a few years, the USA kept true to it. But then the U.S. Congress stopped funding it. U.S. Congress said, "Oh no, we're not gonna fund it." So the supplies that had been promised to North Korea, they weren't coming through. And then when Bush gave his axis of evil speech, at that point, North Korea thought, okay, well, not only are we not getting what we were promised in exchange for not getting nuclear weapons, but now on top of that, Bush is calling us the axis of evil. He's invaded Iraq, one of the axis of evil countries. So at that point, North Korea did develop nuclear weapons. Now, people want to blame this whole thing like they just want to nuke the USA because they're crazy. No, North Korea, I mean, their development of nuclear weapons, their nuclear proliferation is done, in order to keep the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in existence. They feel like they're under attack. I mean, half of their country is still the Republic of Korea, in which there are U.S. troops, which is a country that's supported by the United States. Which for a long time, let's keep in mind, no one ever talks about this. For a long time, South Korea was a military dictatorship. You had Syngman Rhee, you had Park Chung-hee. These were absolute military dictators in South Korea. No one ever talks about that. And you can read about some of the awful things that the Park Chung-hee regime in South Korea, that the Syngman Rhee government in South Korea did. No one ever talks about that. Yes, at this point they do have free elections in South Korea, but I should really say free elections in quotes, because what they call the Unified Progressive Party, which was a left-wing socialist party, was forcibly broken up by the government of North Korea, and they have these national security laws in North Korea that basically, or in South Korea, I should say, the South Korean government has these national security laws, and these national security laws, basically the way they work is that if you say anything remotely sympathetic to the North, if you say anything remotely sympathetic to communism, you can go to prison for 2 years, right? Now, that's not free speech, but no one ever talks about that. And there's a whole history of like labor unions when they, when they're on strike and all of that, them getting, violent. I mean, South Korea, there's a whole history there of struggle and protest, of military dictatorships and student uprisings in the 80s demanding democracy. No one ever talks about that. We're just taught, this narrative we get from the U.S. government is good Korea, bad Korea, right? South Korea is this beautiful land of milk and honey is free. North Korea is this evil, awful country. Korea's one country. Let's be clear about that. Korea's one country. It's divided, and that both countries have a lot more than meets the eye to them. I mean, the Korean people have been through so much, since the country was divided, since the end of the Second World War. I mean, the Korean folks have been divided. And they have suffered, and no one wants to talk about that. The narrative we get is North Korea is pure evil, and we should all be trembling in our boots because they're going to drop a nuke on us. Well, North Korea is not going to nuke the United States anytime soon. Now, this is me, of course, giving my opinion, editorializing. This is not my journalism. Let me be clear on that. Oh boy, so what else do we have here? Yes, Google did censor the World Socialist website. Well, that is true. I actually got to meet David North, the editor of the World Socialist website, when he came by. Related to my job, I got to see him, and that was kind of interesting. So I had never actually met him. What else is here? How do you feel about the Justice Democrats purging Cenk Uygur over sexist blog posts he made back in 2000? A lot of progressives fear that the organization is becoming too identitarian. That's from Da Cobbler. I don't know anything about that. I really don't. I can't comment on it. Greetings from Australia. Keep up the good work. Well, great. Australia. Australia's economy is doing really well. Whenever I'm out in New York City, I see a lot of people from Australia who are tourists, who are here on vacation, and they tell me, oh yeah, we're doing great. We're having a boom. And you know why Australia is doing really great? China. That's right. The Chinese boom is causing, China to do a lot of trade with their Pacific neighbor, Australia, right? So at this point, while the Western world, most of the Western world that you could call, I mean, Australia is technically not the Western, they're not located in the West, but they're considered to be a quote unquote industrialized or Western country. And their economy is doing pretty well based on trade with China. I know the former leader of Australia, Kevin Rudd, is actually really supporting China right now and has been going around the world kind of defending the Belt and Road Initiative and speaking in support of them. So there you go. There you go. What else is here? More than the tyranny that exists in South Korea is that the people know the U.S. maintains operational control over the South Korean military. And that's the truth, too. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of U.S. troops. Absolutely. And yeah, there is pro-gun red. He's quoting what I wrote in an article called Let's Talk About Korea, where I said, people ask me, do you support North Korea? And I say, no, I support all of Korea. And that's the point I've made. Best arguments against China-bashing leftists. That's from Ramiro Funes, a good journalist. I believe he's working out of Ecuador these days. Well, let's back up here, because I feel like, the people who say China is not socialist, right? That's the main thing. They say, well, China calls itself socialism with Chinese characteristics, but clearly there's billionaires there, there's private companies, it's not socialist. Well, we need to talk about what the difference between socialism and capitalism is, because this is something there's not a lot of clarity on. What is the difference? Now, is capitalism any society with money? Well, the Soviet Union had money. Cuba's got money. Any country that has had a Marxist government that has called itself socialist, they've all got money. So China has money. That doesn't mean that. Now, people say, well, socialism is where the state or the workers control the means of production. People say, well, the workers control the means of production. And people say, well, the state is like above the workers, so it doesn't. Well, okay, yes, but again, even in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, there was a huge amount of private business, and even still, the means of production. We're talking major industries and stuff. In the Soviet Union, there was kind of a party elite. There were people in the party that had, more control over it than your average shop floor worker. So, that's kind of hard to measure. And then people will say, well, socialism is any society that's moving toward communism, and that's completely immeasurable. That's just a matter of opinion. So what is socialism? What is socialism, right? And this is a very important point, because nowadays people don't know what socialism is. People, you listen to a lot of Bernie Sanders, supporters and stuff, and they'll say socialism is a government that works for everyone, or, socialism is the post office. I've heard that's a very common one. Well, the difference between capitalism and socialism, this is what I'm telling you it is. Capitalism is a society in which profits are in command. Friedrich Engels, he said, under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Mao Zedong talked about profits in command. Karl Marx defined capitalism as the anarchy of production. Under capitalism, things get done so capitalists can make money from them. This building I'm living in, it wasn't built so I could live in it. It was built so a landlord and a bank could make money from building it, right? You go down the line. Everything in capitalist society is done for the purpose of making profits. That's what capitalism is. Capitalism is a society in which production is organized to make profits for those who own the means of production. It's the anarchy of production. It's profits in command. That's what capitalism is. Capitalism is not, people having lots of money. Capitalism is not people being greedy. Capitalism is not freedom. That's one I've heard, from the right wing. Oh, capitalism is freedom. No. Capitalism is an economic system in which production is carried out for the purpose of making profits for owners. So what is socialism? Well, that's where we're starting to get a little bit messy here. Now, Marx never talked about socialism. He talked about the first stage of communism and the second stage of communism. If you read the Communist Manifesto, he's talking about the first stage of communism and the second stage of communism. He says the first stage of communism is when, we have a centrally planned economy and the workers control the means of production, the dictatorship of the proletariat, and he lists 10 things that they would do after taking over. And then the second stage, of this higher stage, this ideal where there's no need for a government and people can just kind of do what they want and take what they need because there's been such a huge level of material abundance that's been created. So that's Marx. And of course, Marx is talking about the Western world. He's talking about Germany and Britain and France. And in his mind, all these working class people who were working in factories, they would continue to get poorer as the capitalists got richer, and eventually they would just seize control of their factories and seize control of the government, and that would be socialism. Well, that never happened. That's the problem, and it didn't happen because of imperialism. I mean, that's our understanding. I mean, that was what Lenin wrote, is that, that as this divide between the first world and the third world, came into existence, and the bankers and the billionaires that run the Western countries were able to divide the workers at home, and create what they would call a labor aristocracy, give workers in the Western countries some privilege, and give them a comfortable lifestyle, keep them loyal to the empire and not fighting back, because of that. And then because of the billionaires and bankers in the Western countries dominating the whole world, keeping the whole world poor, because of that divide, that didn't happen. So the socialism or the first stage of communism that Karl Marx envisioned never happened. The workers in the Western countries did not rise up and seize their factories because of imperialism. So Lenin says that the revolution is going to happen not in the West, but in the East. This is in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He says, look, the working class in the Western countries is divided, it's stratified, so the revolution is really going to happen in the Eastern countries. At the time of the Russian Revolution, Russia was not really fully capitalist. It was largely a feudal society. There were factories in the cities, but for the most part, it was feudalism. And so, so Russia, they have the Russian Revolution, and people forget that Russia, or the Soviet Union, didn't say it was fully socialist until 1936. Right, so after the Russian Revolution, Lenin says, we're not socialist here. We're not even state capitalist, but state capitalism might be better than what we have. They had the new economic policy where the industries, the banks were under the control of the government, but most of the economy was private. And then you had 1928, you had the 5-year plans, Stalin, building up state-run industries, kind of mobilizing the population. Soviet Union says that they were socialist. They weren't socialist fully until 1936. So we have like a second definition of what Marx calls the first stage of communism, or later it is called socialism. You have this idea, well, this is the kind of state-run economy that the Soviet Union built and had fully constructed in 1936. So that's one definition. However, that gets a little bit murky too, because because that political that model doesn't exist anywhere in the world today. You go to China, the Soviet Union collapsed. Cuba has market reforms. There's all kinds of private businesses there. Vietnam, all kinds of private businesses. Even North Korea now, everything is run by the military. It's like a military economy. It's probably closer to what they called war communism, which was the model where the military ran everything. But even they would like to do economic reforms. The leadership of North Korea has many times stated they want foreign investment. They want to open up. So this idea that that's the only type of socialism. Socialism is that system created in 1928 by Stalin, in which you have a one-party state that gives 5-year plans and everything. It's like 90% state control. That's the only type of socialism that exists. If that's the case, then history ended, because that system, that model of doing things is not going to return anytime soon. I mean, not that it didn't achieve huge things. It defeated Hitler. It raised the Soviet Union out of poverty. It did some tremendous, amazing things. But that political model is not, and to be fair, Karl Marx he didn't live to see the Soviet Union or anything like that. The only thing that he saw was the Paris Commune of 1871. And the Paris Commune, which Marx loved and said this is the first dictatorship of the proletariat and they're storming heaven, it looked nothing like what had come later. So, there's a lot of questions. Now, basically my understanding, and this is the understanding, I know very well what capitalism is. There's all this controversy about what socialism is. It's pretty clear in my understanding. Socialism is when the economy is organized to serve public good and to serve public need. When you have an economy that is not based on profits, but is centrally planned and organized to serve the good of society, that's socialism. And that's the difference between capitalism and socialism. Capitalism is the anarchy of production. It's based on profits. Socialism is a planned economy designed to serve the public. There's something called Bonapartism, and that's when capitalists will be trying to organize and control the economy, and it doesn't really work. If you look at the many examples, they'll have some kind of really authoritarian government that's desperately trying to control the economy, and maybe they are able to control it a little bit on behalf of one section of the capitalist class, but Bonapartism never really creates a planned economy. Napoleon or Louis Bonaparte, when he was a leader in France, and he was trying to kind of control capitalism capitalism, it didn't really work. You can't really have controlled capitalism. You can have capitalism with a lot of state intervention and a lot of state ownership, but if that state ownership is just, kind of where the state is a middleman and the economy still functions to serve capitalist owners, that's not socialism. Socialism is an economy that is centrally planned and not organized to make profits for a group of owners. So if that wasn't enough words for you, there you go. Now I'm going to look and see what else is out there. And that's, I guess I should finish up the point about China. Well, that's why I would say China is not capitalist. Because if you look at China's economy, it's centrally planned. I mean, they have 5-year plans. All the major industries that matter, steel manufacturing, telecommunications, it's all essentially state-controlled. Even the private companies don't really have economic freedom. The Communist Party has absolute control. It's not an economy that functions according to profits. It functions according to a central plan. And that's not capitalism. That's socialism. And it's not about the level of state ownership. I mean, there are socialist countries with a huge amount of private ownership, but if the economy, if even those private companies don't have the freedom to do really what they want and they're forced to cooperate with a state central plan, that's socialism in my view. Oh boy, so here we go. Venezuela has the best democratic elections voting system in the world. Well, that's interesting. I don't know about best. I can't compare it to anything. When I was in Venezuela, they showed us how the ballots were set up. It was very, very democratic to me. It's a very, very democratic society. And as far as I could tell, when they showed how the ballots are designed, that all the parties that are on the ballot have a role in, helping to design. They showed how the ballots are counted, how there's an electronic vote, but then everyone gets a ticket also, and the way that they confirm, and they have people from the party, and, and how, it's not, it's what they call proportional representation. So it's not, people don't end up voting for the lesser of two evils. They vote for the party that they support, and the parties get their seats based on how many people, how many votes they get. So it's like you can vote for the party that you want. You don't have to vote against the one you don't like. It's very interesting. I mean, their democratic system. I did visit the Center for the National Elections in Venezuela. I looked at that ballot. That was a huge ballot. 35 different parties on the ballot. The parties themselves get to design the layout of the ballot. And when I was there, I must say I was there in December of 2015, and that was the first election since 1999 that the United Socialist Party or the Chavistas, or before that they were the Movement for the Fifth Republic, but it was the first time that the Chavistas lost, and they lost, and they lost, and the leaders of the Electoral Commission got on, they read the results, Chavistas lost, period. They lost, and then there was no violence. Interesting, right? Because every time that Chavez won, every time Maduro won, the streets were full of violence and blood and killing, and these rich students that were angry, they went out and they tore things up. Well, this time the Chavistas lost, so they lost, and they didn't go kill anyone, they didn't burn any buildings down, they lost, and they lost the election, and no one talked about that. I thought that was weird. If whenever the Chavistas win, they always cry fraud, and they're always supporting all this rioting. They lost the election, and everyone knew they would lose. They lost, and they lost because not because people didn't like socialism, and that's the interesting thing. I talked to so many people who voted for the opposition. They all told me they loved socialism. Most of them told me they loved Hugo Chavez. They just said that they didn't. They were mad at how the United Socialist Party had been handling the current crisis. So it was a punishment vote. And, to be fair, the leader of the opposition in Venezuela, Enrique Capriles, actually calls himself a socialist. So this idea that people in Venezuela hate socialism, they're all starving because of socialism, yeah, we gotta look past that. I mean, even the leader of the opposition calls himself a socialist. Nobody wants to return to how Venezuela was before 1999. People told me some real horror stories about that period. How the electricity wouldn't come on, and for weeks, and how garbage wouldn't be collected, and how just, as with the IMF and the privatizations, Venezuela was just being looted. This is a really wealthy country in terms of oil, and it was just being looted. People were hungry and suffering. Now, they have quite a few problems there. My friend Dakota Lilly was actually in Venezuela more recently, but yeah, they've had some difficulties, no doubt, but at this point, I don't think, at least when I was there in 2015, I did not meet a single person who said, you know what, I want to go back to the way things were in 1999. I never met anyone who said that. No one said things were better before Hugo Chavez. But that's what you'd read in the American media. That's what they always say is, Hugo Chavez came in and wrecked the place. No one told me that. No one told me that at all. So there you go. Can you describe how nationalized industry works? How how society and a group of owners. Very, very interesting. So, can you tell me how nationalized industry works? Well, yeah, I mean, in most countries in the world, most countries in the world, there's some level of nationalization, and especially in terms of natural resources like oil and natural gas. At this point, the USA, we have a huge amount of oil and natural gas. I mean, lots and lots of oil and natural gas. Except we're not getting any of the profits from it. The profits from our oil and our natural gas are all going to the private corporations. I mean, because of hydraulic fracking, we're extracting huge amounts of oil and natural gas, but we average Americans who live here are getting poorer. And there's a huge budget deficit. They're cutting all the social programs, cutting spending, austerity, austerity, austerity. Meanwhile, the ground that we live on, our soil, is producing more wealth for these big oil and big natural gas companies than ever before. Right? I don't understand this. For years, they used to tell us that energy independence was the way to go. That was the old position, right? If only we could have energy independence, then there wouldn't be these big wars, right? Because we would have no reason to be in the Middle East. We'd have our own oil and we wouldn't bother them. We have energy independence now. The oil export ban that was passed during the OPEC boycott back in the 70s, that's been lifted. We're selling American oil all over the world. Now, we're still importing oil from Nigeria and from Saudi Arabia and places like that, but we have loads of oil in the United States, yet we're still having wars. And why? Because these wars are not about going there to get their oil. It's not like we're going there and we're trying to get their oil. It's about establishing a monopoly. It's about keeping a monopoly for the bankers and billionaires that run the oil companies. And that's really what's going on here. You look at Iraq. This was a country that had an independent state-run oil company. It was competing with Wall Street, and so it was smashed. And did we go get their oil? Oil production in Iraq is about 12% of what it was under Saddam Hussein. So they've just been blown off the market, and now anyone who was buying oil from Iraq is now buying it from American oil companies. Look at all the countries the USA doesn't like around the world. They all tend to have independent state-run oil companies that are competing, that are selling oil on the international market and competing with the oil bankers that run the United States. Venezuela, state-run oil company competing with Wall Street. Iran, state-run oil company competing with Wall Street, right? Angola, right? All of a sudden we're hearing about the MPLA and how much we don't like them, and there's this big demonization campaign against Isabel dos Santos, right? Well, state-run oil company competing with Wall Street. Gaddafi, Libya, they had a state-run oil company that was competing with Wall Street. Russia, major oil and natural gas producer, huge amounts of oil and natural gas, and so of course we hate Russia. These billionaires, they want a monopoly. They want the whole world buying from them. They want to rake in profits from the entire world. And that's the nature of imperialism. Imperialism is not a synonym for like aggression. It doesn't mean, when one country goes into another country, that's not what imperialism is. Imperialism is a system in which bankers or monopolists based in Western countries, financial capitalists, control the world market, beat down any competitors, and keep the world poor. They keep the world underdeveloped so that they can stay rich. Imperialism is not about, and that's the other thing, is that, the imperialists, they always say that they're doing it out of kindness, right? Whenever there's an attack on a country, whenever there's, the domination of a country by Western corporations, the narrative that we always hear is, oh, this is done because, we're helping them develop. We're helping them. A lot of leftists believe this. I don't understand this at all, but a lot of leftists are under the impression that the USA failed in Iraq, right? The USA failed in Iraq, right? Prior to the U.S. invading Iraq, you had a dictator, Saddam Hussein. Maybe dictator is not the right word. He was the leader of the country, the leader of the Ba'ath Socialist Party, a strongman government. Forgive me for saying dictator there. No offense to my Iraqi friends. But you had a strong central government with the Ba'ath Socialist ideology, and it was in power, and the country was somewhat stable, and it was blown to pieces. Iraq has been blown to pieces. Now ISIS is in Iraq. Now people in Iraq have fled. People are just not living there any longer. There's different factions fighting with each other. There's electricity in the country. There's problems with electricity. Iraq is just ruined. But Iraq is also not selling very much oil. It's about 12% of the oil that was sold. The little bit of oil they are selling, they're selling to China. So at this point, Iraq, Iraq has been blown to pieces, and you'll get people, some of which wrote books that I'm seeing behind me, who shall not be named, who will repeat this silliness that somehow The USA failed in Iraq. Well, the USA did not fail in Iraq. The point was to destroy a competitor, and a competitor was destroyed. I mean, this is this. How is this failure? And they say, well, the USA wanted to go there and control it and get their oil. No, imagine that you had a store. Okay, you had a store and you sold bicycles, and there was a bicycle shop across the street. Would you want to go take over that bicycle shop? No, because then you would own two bicycle shops on the same street. That would just be silly. No, you want that other store to just go away. You want it gone so that everyone has to buy their bicycles from you. You don't want to own two bicycle shops on both sides of the street. That would just be silliness. You just want that other bicycle shop to go away so everyone has to buy from you. Monopoly. Financial monopoly. That's imperialism. Spheres of influence. Captive markets. This economic understanding of imperialism is just missing in left-wing circles. So let me see what else is there. Enrique Capriles is a fraud. You betcha he is. He is the equivalent of Hillary Clinton. You betcha he is. I don't support him at all. Don't get me wrong. Gilbert Feliciano, you're right. You're totally right. I am not a supporter of Capriles at all. I was just simply pointing out that in his rhetoric that he uses, he describes himself as a socialist. So if people were voting for him because they hated socialism, that wouldn't be accurate. That was all I was saying. No, the guy's funded by the USA. He's an anti-government person. He wants to tear down the Bolivarian Project. I'm not a supporter of that guy. Please don't confuse what I'm saying. Please don't. I'm not a supporter of him. So Gilbert, gotta go. Great show. Well, there you go. Rachel Maddow is a poster girl for World War III. How controlled is the American media, and by who? Well, that's very interesting, because Rachel Maddow, I used to watch her show more regularly than I do now. And I remember when I don't think I've watched it in years, but when I used to watch it regularly, and that was back in, around the time Obama was getting into office and all of that, I remember she would just rant against the Koch brothers. It's like the Koch brothers are these evil men who own this oil company. Well, where is she broadcasting from? Where does Rachel Maddow broadcast her show? Rockefeller Center. And who are the Rockefellers? That's a family. That's Standard Oil, probably the most ruthless oil banking elite family ever. And MSNBC, you can go through the history. I mean, it used to be directly owned by General Electric, which is a very big military contractor. It was owned by the Morgans. This is corporate media. Rachel Maddow, she has this kind of liberal edge to what she's doing. But at the end of the day, she's representing probably, I would say, more powerful financial interests than the folks supporting Trump. Because I feel like, there's always been kind of a divide among the rich and powerful in the USA. And that the more rich and powerful, like the ultra rich and powerful, we're talking like the six families. They're talking about the Morgans, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, who else? The Mellons. There's other ones, but these really powerful elite families in the United States, they tend to be more liberal because they can afford it, and they want the government more involved in the economy because they can get the government contract because they have enough wealth. And it's these kind of lower level capitalists like the Koch brothers, like the Walton family that owns Walmart, like Sheldon Adelson out in Las Vegas, and they feel like they're not part of the club. They may have millions and millions of dollars, but they're not part of that entrenched wealthy circle. So there's kind of a divide. And I feel like in a lot of ways Trump kind of represents, the lower levels of American capital that are kind of resentful of these really entrenched and more financialized monopolies. And there's a divide among American capitalism. I would say the divide among American capitalism at this point that we're witnessing with Trump in office, with, the media at war with Trump, the divide among American capitalism is bigger than it's ever been in my lifetime. The ruling circles, the circles of power in the United States at this point are very, very, very divided. And that's quite an interesting point. Greetings from Japan. I have a question. What are your thoughts on Stalinism? Well, first of all, let's be clear what we're talking about here, because there is no ideology known as Stalinism, and Stalin was the first person to tell you that. There's actually there was a famous document in which Stalin met with leaders of the U.S. Communist Party. And he castigated them because they were calling themselves Stalinists. And he said, there's no such thing as Stalinism, and you're just kissing up to me, and I don't appreciate that. Very interesting. You ought to read Stalin's speech to the American communists. So that's interesting. That was in the 20s. But anyhow, and I got to go here in a little bit. I'll be on for like 5 more minutes, and then I'm going to go. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, hey, folks, looks like I have to go, so I'll be talking to you later. Have a good evening, but we'll talk about Stalinism some other time. All the best.